Magid, and this is Doing Tech Right, a podcast from ConnectSafely, where we and our guests speak about parenting, tech, and related topics, along with strategies and policies to make tech safer and more civil. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and visit us at ConnectSafely.org. Excited to be speaking with Erin Williamson, who is the Chief Program and Strategy Officer at Love 146, where she spent over a decade fighting child trafficking through trauma-informed care, prevention education, and survivor advocacy. With 20 plus years in the field, Erin brings deep insight into protecting vulnerable youth and driving policy change while balancing her role as a parent and education advocate. Erin holds a Master's of Public Administration from American University and is also a licensed clinical social worker. Erin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an important and sadly timely topic, so let's just delve in. One of the things I've thought a lot about is that young people are hearing a lot about inappropriate behavior and danger these days. What do kids need to know about child trafficking? And what about this talk about child endangerment? How do we make them aware and cautious, but not paranoid?
Yeah, and full disclosure, I'm a parent myself, right? I have a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old, so I am in the thick of things, not only through my work but also personally. And it is really hard, right? You want your kids to grow up and feel like the world is generally a safe place, and you also want them to know how to protect themselves. I think one of the things that we really need to talk about differently is, moving away from the stranger danger concepts, right? Because whether
Mhm.
these kids are meeting these predators online or whether they're meeting them in person, by the time that they're grooming them to exploitation, these are no longer individuals that kids consider strangers, right? This is their best friend that they can tell everything to, their boyfriend, the only person who cares about them or loves them, the person who promised to be the father figure, the parental figure in their life. And so if we continue this narrative of, trafficking and exploitation happens through kidnapping or happens through strangers, we really are missing a huge opportunity to talk to our kids about, really what is a healthy relationship and what do you do when you see red flags in a relationship, no matter who it is, whether it's a teacher, a partner, a neighbor, how do you respond? And it's, really it could be anybody, right? and
Yeah.
and and you need to do that in a way that's both giving them the information but not also, causing them fear of every individual.
So you're probably a lot more up to date than I am on what's going on. But when I was a board member at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which I left about 5 years ago, the reality was that the vast majority of people who abducted or molested children were people that they knew in the real world. Sometimes coaches, sometimes family members, sometimes clergy, trusted adults that actually abused that trust. What you're talking about, at least initially, were people who they're meeting online who sort of become friends, essentially, or at least they think they're friends. So let's talk a little bit about those two buckets, if I may, of predators, the ones that they may actually know and potentially trust in the real world versus the people that they meet online.
Yeah, and I think that, you're right. We still see traffickers being, unfortunately, family members, clergy, coaches. We still see our kids being trafficked by individuals who are already in a relationship with our children, and sometimes in positions of authority or positions that we typically say these are individuals you should be able to go to and trust and have your best interest. I think what we're seeing online is that predators are recognizing that that connection is really important as part of the grooming and recruiting process. And so they're trying to mirror that type of connection through an online community. And I think how they're benefiting from that is that kids no longer see a differentiation between who they know in the quote unquote real world and who they know online. They just see individuals as friends. They might play games with those friends online and only know them online, but they're still their friends, right? They still are connecting with them. And so I think for those of us who are adults, there's a very clear division between people that kids know in person versus online. And yet when we talk to children, that division very much goes away. And as kids are growing up now with the internet just being part of their life at such a young early age, we're seeing any division that kind of did continue to exist, or our ability to say online versus in person, is just dissipating. And so we really need to acknowledge that as adults.
And of course, as you know, there are many benefits to being online. And even if you disagree with that, the reality is that kids are online. It's something that we have to sort of accept, at least for the most part, that kids are going to go online. So, given that they're going to be there, what can we teach our children so that they are enjoying the benefits of their online experience? In fact, maybe even meeting people with similar interests that they don't know in the real world. Certainly in gaming, you do meet people, and sometimes, most of the time, they're wonderful. How do we teach them to enjoy those benefits at the same time protect themselves for those people who are out to harm them?
No, it's a great question. And actually, we created an email series at Love 146 specifically for parents, introducing technology and especially kind of social media level technology to kids and comparing it to teaching your child to cross the street, right? You're not going to take a young child and drop them in the middle of New York Times and say, good luck, right? Well, you're
Mhm,
going to first hold their hand, go to a safe street, talk to them about looking both ways, and then as they get older, eventually you'll drop their hand, eventually you'll let them cross the street alone. The idea is that by the time they're 18, they could go to New York City and navigate it successfully on their
mhm,
own. And the same is really true of the internet. What we see happen is a lot of times parents will just hand over a device and there will be no parental safety features that are enabled on it. They'll have done kind of no effort initially to really lock down what their kid has access to. And so then they end up in this situation where they're very much reacting to whatever horrible things can happen online. And then that can cause more frustration and tension with their kids who feel like I just got something taken away from me, as opposed
mhm.
to we're going to start you off small. We're going to start you off really protected. I'm going to get to, see things. You're going to have a lot of limitations. And as you grow older, as you show me that you can handle this, and as you just developmentally get older, then I will increase your ability to have access and to talk with people. And I think we also just have to have very blatant conversations with our kids about how predators do connect with kids online.
And by the way, I love your New York City analogy, although I don't use New York as an example because I love New York. I do talk about that a lot in terms of, walking your kids to school, and then eventually they have a crosswalk, and ultimately they drive to school or they ride their bikes to school,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
et cetera. Your organization, as I recall, focuses on sex trafficking, which is one of the ways children are exploited. Can you talk about sex trafficking versus other forms of exploitation, just so we can kind of put that into context?
Absolutely. So we also work with some labor trafficking. I should say that comes
Mm,
into some of our work. A lot of times, what we'll see is that there's a commingling of exploitation, right? So it's not an evenly divided. We might have a kid who is being sex trafficked, but also there is financial, right? There's some sort of sextortion financially that's happening as
mhm.
part of that exploitation, or they're being trafficked but they're also being forced to work in a nightclub, for example. And so a lot of times we do see a commingling. We'll also see a lot of intimate partner violence that will go along with trafficking victimization, especially if their trafficker is someone they identify as a romantic partner. And so it's very common for trafficking to be just one form of exploitation that child is experiencing. And yet it does seem to be the one that rises to the level of getting them kind of attention and help and recognizing that this is something where intervention is really needed.
And help me understand this, because I think of trafficking as when you literally have sort of you've essentially kidnapped the child and you're taking them somewhere versus other forms of exploitation, for example, behind the bleachers or, in the coach's office. I don't mean to pick on coaches because
Absolutely.
most of them are wonderful as well, but in that adult's office or somewhere, and then the kid comes home. So Do I have that right? The difference between those 2?
Well, so interestingly enough, the large majority of individuals who are referred to us are living at home when they get referred to us. And kidnapping is almost never involved in the trafficking we're seeing.
Mhm,
And so, I do think that there's a lot of how trafficking is depicted in movies and in social media that unfortunately perpetuates inaccurate thoughts regarding how this looks. A lot of times, what we see are episodic kind of exploitations where maybe the kid does go away for a night or two or runs away for a night or two, but they do return home, right? And maybe they'll continue to run, but they oftentimes return home. Or we've also had kids that have been exploited telling their parents that they're doing after school activities, not, and those parents having no idea that their traffickers picking them up from school, exploiting them for a couple hours in a nearby hotel, and then returning them in time to take the late bus home. And so that parent thinks that child is in an extracurricular activity when in reality that child's being exploited. And oftentimes traffickers will leverage those relationships with the parents or with others to say, what would they think if they knew that this is actually what you are doing? If they knew. And so they
mhm.
start severing the relationships that those children have with parents, caregivers, siblings, and friends.
I have to tell you, my kids are no longer children. If this were my first introduction to this conversation and I had a teenager, I would be scared to death right now. Help me out here. Help out the parents that are in that situation.
Absolutely.
I mean, again, it gets back to that question of caution, appropriate caution versus being scared to death. Where should people be on that scale?
Absolutely. So, really, I think what you want to do is you want to build up the resiliency of your children. The reality is that most kids are not going to be trafficked, right? Most kids are not going to be sexually exploited. They're going to have wonderful childhoods. They're not going to experience this level of trauma. And so, we start early on with children, teaching them things like our family doesn't have a secret. Right? We don't have
Mhm,
secrets in our family. And we really embed that to our children's kind of ethos of who we are as a family because predators are going to ask kids like, do you know how to keep a secret, right? There are
mhm.
ways in which predators test children to figure out who they're going to go after. So having a child say my family doesn't have secrets, that pings to a predator, oh, this might not be a child that I want to pursue because they're more likely to disclose this information. One of the great conversations you can have with adolescents is saying, look, there are rules in our household. And obviously, I don't want you to break those rules. There are consequences for breaking rules. And yet, you are entering an age in your life where your natural instinct is to push against and possibly
Mhm.
even break those rules. And what I want you to know is the most important thing to me is your safety. It's not that you broke a rule, it's not punish, it's are you safe? And if you ever
Right.
feel in a situation that you're not safe, please come and talk to me. And if you don't feel you can talk to me, please go talk to another adult.
So it's like, the thing that we told our kids, if you go to a party and you drink, obviously we're not happy about that, but we're not gonna punish you for calling us up and asking us to pick you up.
Exactly.
We have to pick our battles and
Exactly.
yeah.
I will say,
Yeah.
I know all the stuff that I know. My children still go to sleepovers. My children still
Mhm.
go to overnight camp. You have to realize at some point that you can put in all of these safety nets. You can do as much as you can and bad things can still happen and I understand that that's really scary as a parent, but really it's just as important that your kids are excited about life and exploring and navigating things and feeling safe and secure in their environments as it is that you're giving them the information of how to protect themselves if and when they ever find themselves in a really challenging or vulnerable situation.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're saying this because you're speaking to the choir right now. Trying to create a balance again between being careful but not being parent. You want the kids to be able to walk to school, but you don't want them running out in the middle of the street and getting hit by a car. I mean,
Absolutely.
I want to go back to that point you made about the child perhaps taking the late bus home, versus the child who is kidnapped and is off somewhere, because that's what we hear about,
Right.
right? As a former member of the national board of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, I heard about almost every case where a child was literally taken
Yep.
somewhere. I'm trying to think about this. So your kid is being sexually exploited, then they come home and have dinner and everything looks normal. I mean, what are the parents missing, and what are the clues that maybe they need to look at to make sure that that's not happening to their child?
Absolutely. So, again, I think one of the best things you can do is really foster open communication at a young age. And this concept of we'll figure it out together as a family, no matter what you share and tell me. That said, if you see significant changes in your child's demeanor, if you see them not wanting to share a lot of information or being very secretive about what they're doing online or on their phone, if you see a drop in grades, if you see any of those signs where you're like, what is happening with my child? Just know that this could be one of those things, right? I think a lot of times we see parents worry about drug use, we see
Mhm.
parents worrying about bullying. This should also be one of the things that falls into that list of do I need to think about this being a possibility? Again, you might not have a child that is at the full level of being exploited where they're actually engaging in sexual relationship in exchange for money, but maybe they're being groomed and recruited, right? Maybe
Mhm.
there's sextortion that later on will lead to trafficking victimization. One of the things that, and again, I just dropped my child off at sleepaway camp and he had to leave his phone at home. And one of the things he said to me was, well, I don't want you going on my phone while I'm away. And I said, okay, let's just be really clear about this. I told you when I gave you that phone was not for privacy. I'm not saying that I'm going to go and rummage and read everything, but if you want privacy, you call somebody or you write something in a diary, right? What you put on the internet, what you put on screens can be screenshot and shared. And so if there are
Mhm.
things you're doing on your phone that you're worried about me seeing, that is concerning. And so those are the types of conversations we need to be having.
Yeah, yeah. This is a hard question, but there's a stereotype of the sexual predator, and I'm sure you agree, as I do, that those stereotypes are often wrong. Talk a little bit about, the type of person who commits these crimes.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen everything. We have seen parents traffic their own children. We've seen uncles or aunts traffic children. We've seen
Mhm.
older siblings exploit their younger siblings. We've seen teachers. We've seen really it has been everybody. It's a situation in which a lot of people put themselves in a place where they have access to children. And so again, I think that we do oftentimes have inaccurate thoughts about who these traffickers are and who these exploiters are. I have even seen couples say to children, if you ever need to get away from your parents, if you ever need to go somewhere, you can always come to our house. We had one couple here who became known to foster care kids as a place that they could turn to if they needed to leave their foster homes. And what those kids didn't realize is that after staying with them for a week, that couple would start to say to them, we really need you to contribute. We don't mind having you here, but we're feeding you, we're taking care of you. Is there a way that you can help us financially contribute? And we can help you figure that out. And then that's how they would start to exploit them.
Mm, mm. Wow. And I actually literally have seen images of men with trench coats and black hats and mustaches. I mean, that is by far an inaccurate portrayal. I mean, they can be almost any age.
Ab-
They are typically men, but not
yep.
always.
Yeah. We see.
And they can be any social class, any profession.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to another question, which is internet rumors. I remember when there was an organization called Save the Children, which is a good, legitimate organization. I think it's based somewhere in Europe, and it does, in fact, save
Yep.
children. It protects children. And their hashtag Save the Children, was used by people who are spreading these crazy, and I'm saying crazy, but maybe I shouldn't say that because a lot of people believed.
Yep.
And in fact, I think increasingly people are believing some of these theories about the global elite drinking children's blood. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And it's been in the news, certainly lately, over the whole Jeffrey Epstein issue. How do we get people to focus on the actual dangers versus the imaginary ones?
Yes, yeah, and I remember the Save the Children situation as well. And it's really hard, right? We see people with nefarious intent using the issue of child trafficking to spread false rumors, to get people to follow them, to spread conspiracy theories. And it is a real challenge that we have, right? Because then that perpetuates false ideas, both about what trafficking looks like, but also what you need to do to protect your children, right? And so then we end up in a situation where those individuals who, again, have really, I think, the individuals that are following these, they have good intent, right? Those people who
Hmm.
were using that hashtag for the most part were people that were trying to help children, but they have just this false concept. And I think one of the things that we need to do a better job at is when we hear things that we know don't sound right or sound Google, right? Google does this. Is this a conspiracy theory? And really try to read something that you can trust or reach out to, somebody that you know that works in the human trafficking industry or related industry and say, is this legit? This doesn't seem legit. I will tell you, recently a similar situation happened with Wayfair. I had my own
Hmm.
family reaching out asking me if this was legitimate. But,
This is where the allegation was they were shipping children in packages,
right.
right? Inside the furniture.
Right, and
Right,
based on what furniture you bought and what color you bought, a certain type of child would show up at your doorstep. And I
right.
have very smart family members who believed that that was potentially true, at least to the point that they reached out to me. And it is really concerning. I wish it would stop happening. I don't think it's going to stop happening. I worry it will just continue. To your point, Epstein shows that individuals at all socioeconomic
Mhm.
levels are engaged in this type of horrific victimization and behavior. But it doesn't necessarily show that there's, some sort of government conspiracy theory where we're hiding people under, under the Capitol and children are being, sent to different offices. And so oftentimes what they'll do is they will take a story that is true to begin with and then add the conspiracy part to it. And it's a shame. It's not helpful. It actually, with the Wayfair thing, we ended up with so many calls to the National Human Trafficking Hotline that it actually hindered the ability for true victims to be able to call the hotline and access resources. Try to fight back
Yeah.
against those conspiracy theories as you hear about them in your own family and social circles.
Tell us about your hotline. What kind of work have you done with the hotline?
So the hotline is actually a national hotline that we're one of the organizations they make referrals to, but this is
Okay.
a national hotline that's currently operated by Polaris. And it's a wonderful resource both for individuals who are concerned that they're experiencing trafficking. They can call anonymously, they can call for supports and services. It's also a great resource for community members who may have concerns about individuals that they're coming across and they're not sure how to respond or what the best thing to do is.
And how do people access the hotline?
Yep, the hotline is 1 888 373 7888.
And is there an online component to it as well
There
or
is.
texting?
There's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You can Google. They have a ton of resources that are really wonderful. And, while we're talking about resources, I should also mention NCMEC's Take It Down, which is a
Yes.
really
NCMEC, by the way, is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
acronyms. The National
Yeah.
Center for Missing and Exploited Children also has a wonderful resource called Take It Down. If you or anybody you know who's under the age of 18 has any images that are explicit in nature, they can help you kind of scrape the internet to take those images down.
Mhm.
And that's a really wonderful thing that didn't exist even just a few years ago. And that's a really, when you have images online, that can be something that is re-traumatizing for kids, right? Because then they can get those images emailed to again and again and again to them. And I would also be, remiss if I didn't mention our own hotline, which is love146.org. And we have a lot of resources on there, especially for parents that are trying
Mhm.
to figure out, how do I navigate these conversations with kids? Like you were saying, how do I balance the teaching them kind of what they need to know and to protect themselves with also not making them scared that around the corner is everywhere there's a boogeyman.
And if you're listening from outside the United States, there are hotlines all over the world. In Europe, there's In Hope, and certainly you should look for whatever resources are available in your country if you're outside the US. So, Erin, most of what we talked about, fortunately, is relatively rare in the sense that the odds are pretty likely that your children are not being victimized. But there is something that's increasingly common,
Ah,
sextortion. Again, it's still not affecting every child, but A lot of young people are, especially young boys, are getting, I'll show you, you show me yours, I'll show you mine. And suddenly the perpetrator has an image of the child. And now they've got ammunition that they can use to get the child to either provide sexual services or more images or financial. There's some kind of follow up crime that'll occur. I don't know if that's something your organization works on, but I know we're very concerned about it at Connect Safely.
Yeah, and one of the things that those, situations can lead to is trafficking, right? We oftentimes will see sextortion take place as part of the grooming, recruitment, and exploitation process. Because then once they have an image, it's easier for them to say, well, let's meet in person, right? This is what I expect of you. And so we are seeing it and it is happening. I also would note that, we talk a lot about social media, but we see a lot of this also happening on gaming sites, right? I think a lot of
Mm,
times parents are heavily focused on social media, as they understandably should be, but they forget that gaming sites also allow a lot of unfettered access to children unless certain settings are changed and certain rules are applied. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of this will happen because we don't talk about boys to boys, and there is an added level of difficulty with them coming to for help or disclosing
mhm.
what's happening to them, because there is this sense like this shouldn't happen to boys or this doesn't happen to boys, because we don't openly talk about it as much as we do
And
with
there's a certain shame. I mean,
girls. Absolutely.
they were obviously tempted. In many cases, what happens is a perpetrator will show an image of an attractive young girl about their age, and they're engaging in kind of a virtual sexual thing, and maybe they're embarrassed to even admit
Right,
it.
right. Yes, and then oftentimes there's this threat of, if you don't do X, then I'm going to expose this photo, whether I'm going to send it to your family members, I'm going to spread it around your school. And so again, talking to your kids proactively, image sharing is, and I hate to say this, but somewhat normative among
Yes.
certain age groups. And so you don't even have to start this conversation with a worst case scenario. You've met a perpetrator online. You can start this just with a basic conversation about image sharing, because kids who are adolescents are hearing about other kids in their social circles who are sharing images, whether it's through romantic
Right.
relationships or other things. And you can talk to them and again, ultimately say, I'm hopeful that you won't share an image. I want you to know that, once you take that image, you really have lost control over where that image can go. But also, if that image ever does get taken or get out there, that is not the worst thing. I will not be embarrassed if you tell me that. I will not be ashamed of you. The most important thing in that situation, again, is your safety. And I want you to
Mhm.
please come to me before you do anything rash, because we unfortunately are seeing children who are committing suicide as a result of
Yeah.
sextortion.
Yeah, no, I've actually had a call from a doctor friend of mine whose 18-year-old son was victimized, and he was really worried about him because the kid had some emotional instability issues to begin with. And I assured him that in the long run, this too shall
I know.
pass. You can put it in the rearview mirror, because the alternative, of course, was dreadful. And we really wanted that young man to move past it. So it's very important. And again, it got to a point I was about to ask you is, we all make mistakes. Kids make mistakes. Adults make mistakes. We do things we regret. There is usually a path to recovery. Not always, but usually. And I think it's important for young people to understand that.
Absolutely, right? And oftentimes when we first start working with a youth, they think that, this defines who they are, right? Because again, oftentimes perpetrators reinforce that narrative,
Hmm.
right? You'll never be nothing but this. This is who you are. You're dirty now. You're tainted now. This will never escape. We hear all of
Hmm.
that kind of narrative being told to these children. And so you have to go in and counter that with, just like you said, right now this feels like a huge huge thing in your life, and I'm not saying that it's not, but when you're 20, when you're 30, when you're 40, this will become smaller and smaller and smaller, and some of what is needed is just time for you to live life and know that it goes on. And I also want you to know that you are more than what has happened to you. This does not define who you are. This does not define all the value that you have. One of the things is that there's a certain cohort of children that we're working with that, for a wide variety of reasons, can't envision a long-term future for themselves, and so have taken excessive risks. And helping all kids, no matter whether they've been exploited or not, envision a future for themselves, and really helping them understand the steps that they need to take to make that future become reality, is both really empowering and can also be a really, really important process of the healing journey, because they can see, oh, when I take these steps, I can make change in my life. I get to determine to a certain extent where I'm going with my life and what I'm going to do. And we have these amazing stories of children who
Yeah.
are now in college. We have a lot of kids that have gone into healthcare as a result of, getting a CNA, or gone into, mental health services because they want to help kids of their own. And we also have kids that have gone into completely unrelated jobs and employment experiences, but they're really successful. And again, have started to kind of move beyond the exploitation that has happened to them, both physically and emotionally.
Well, on that positive note, I think we can call at least a pause to this conversation, because this is a conversation that we should have again, just as
Absolutely.
parents should have this conversation more than once with their children about the safe use of the internet, all aspects of it. Erin Williamson, I really appreciate your taking the time, and I wish you the best of luck with the important work that you're
Thank
doing.
you so much. And thank you so much for highlighting this important topic.
Doing Tech Right is produced by Christopher Lee. Maureen Cochan is executive producer. Theme music by Will Magid. I'm Larry Magid.